The first cold wind of October came out of the north like it had something to prove. Jackson Cole gripped the steering wheel with one gloved hand, the other resting gently on the head of his German shepherd, Bruno, who sat tall in the passenger seat like a soldier on watch. The old Ford pickup groaned over every crack in the frost-bitten road, its heater long dead, windows fogging with the breath of 2 survivors who'd run out of places to call home. Jackson was 42, shoulders still squared from habit, but everything else about him sagged with wear, his flannel shirt, the stubble on his jaw, the hollowness in his eyes. He hadn't shaved in days, maybe weeks. After 2 tours in Iraq with the Army Signal Corps and a discharge that came with more scars than medals, he'd tried to rebuild. The trying had stopped 6 months ago, right around the time the last job fell through and the last friend stopped answering his calls. Bruno, 8 years old and silver-grey with an old scar behind his left ear, had never once left his side. They'd been driving through the upper Midwest for 3 days. Cheap gas, cold coffee, dry dog food from a feed store that didn't ask questions. Jackson was down to less than $30, and the truck had started making a sound that could mean anything or everything. Ahead, pine trees gave way to a narrow valley, and a wooden sign just off the shoulder. It leaned at an angle like the wind had tried to take it down more than once. In faded paint, "Welcome to Hollow Creek, where the wind carries the stories." Jackson slowed. There wasn't much left of the town, just a cluster of rooftops, a gas station that looked like it had closed before Y2K, and a handful of shops with dust in the windows. But something pulled at him. Not nostalgia, not even hope. Just the tired instinct of a man who'd learned that quiet places sometimes meant safety. Bruno's ears perked up. His nose twitched once, twice, then pointed straight ahead. "You smell something, boy?" Jackson asked. Bruno didn't bark. He never did unless it mattered. They rolled into the heart of town, the truck's headlights cutting across shuttered buildings and a long-forgotten post office. Then Bruno let out a low whuff and shifted his body toward the passenger side window. Jackson followed his gaze and saw it, a wooden storefront with chipped white paint, a small bell hanging above the door, and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Hollow Creek Radio, Voice of the North." For a moment, the world stopped. Jackson hadn't thought about radio in years, not since he'd manned signal towers in Mosul, stringing antennae through broken buildings, broadcasting coordinates and casualty reports to voices that never answered. But the sight of that old transmitter tower behind the shop, rusted but still standing, scraped something loose inside him. He pulled over. The engine clicked in protest as he shut it off. Cold air rushed in when he opened the door. Bruno jumped down first, landing with surprising grace for a dog his age. He sniffed the gravel street, and then the base of the radio tower, as if reacquainting himself with solid ground. Jackson stretched his back, wincing at the stiffness. He was about to return to the truck when the bell above the shop door gave a delicate chime. The door creaked open. And there she was, small, impossibly old, wrapped in a shawl the color of dried lavender. Her hair was snow-white, pulled back into a braided crown. Her eyes, pale blue and piercing, met his with the sharpness of someone who'd seen war in different forms. "You look like you've fought both storms in silence," she said. Jackson froze. "I'm sorry, Mom. We're just passing through." "You're not just passing," she interrupted, her voice a strange blend of brittle and kind. "You're looking for something you don't think exists anymore." Bruno stood still beside him, alert but calm. The woman's eyes shifted down to the dog. A flicker of something passed across her face. Memory, maybe. "That shepherd's got old bones," she murmured. "Like mine. Loyal bones. And he trusts you. That's rare." Jackson nodded slowly. "His name's Bruno." She smiled. "Of course it is." A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the scent of pine and iron. Bruno leaned into Jackson's leg, then gave a quiet nudge forward. Permission. The woman stepped aside. Come in, both of you. Inside, the air smelled of cedar oil and dust. A kettle hissed softly from a cast-iron stove in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old radios, coils of copper wire, and yellowing station logs. The place looked frozen in time, like someone had stopped aging here decades ago. Jackson took off his gloves, but kept his jacket on. Bruno lay down near the heater, eyes half-lidded, but ears still twitching. "You're not from here," she said, pouring tea into mismatched mugs. "No, Ma'am." "But you've been here before," she said, then paused. "Not Hollow Creek, just here." He didn't answer. She handed him the tea anyway. "I'm Ruth. Ruth Everwood." "Jackson Cole. You were Army." He blinked. "How do you know?" "You didn't flinch when the bell rang, and your dog moves like he's done search and rescue." Jackson nodded once. "Signal Corps, Iraq." Her face softened. "Arthur, my husband, built this radio tower in 1938, kept it running through war, blackout drills, storms, and Reagan. After he passed, I kept it alive on Sunday nights. No one really listened. But I figured someone might need the voice one day." "I used to build towers," Jackson said quietly. "I'd know how to get it running again." A long silence passed. Ruth set her mug down and stood. She walked over to a cabinet, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside, a tarnished set of tools. "My bones don't climb ladders anymore," she said. "But the roof leaks, and the antenna groans every time the wind shifts." Jackson looked at her, then at Bruno, who hadn't moved. The dog's eyes met his as if to say, "You know we're staying." He exhaled. "Guess I could take a look." Ruth smiled, slow and knowing. "Good," she said, "because when the wind changes in Hollow Creek, it means something's about to happen." Outside, the tower creaked once, as if agreeing. And inside, Jackson Cole sat down for the first time in weeks without his back pressed against a door. The kind of stillness he didn't trust yet. But Bruno had already fallen asleep. Which meant, for now, it was safe. The attic room above Hollow Creek Radio smelled faintly of pine and pipe tobacco, like it had been holding its breath for decades. The ceiling sloped low on both sides, and a small circular window faced the lake, now shrouded in night fog. A twin bed sat beneath a shelf of old broadcast reels, its quilt faded from years of sun and stories. Jackson stood in the doorway, backpack still on his shoulder, taking it all in. Bruno padded across the wooden floor, sniffing each corner with methodical caution. The dog paused at the heater, gave a soft grunt of approval, then lay down, his body forming a crescent against the baseboard. "Not much, but it keeps the wind out," Ruth had said, patting the banister as she showed him up earlier. "It's seen more thunder than sleep in recent years." Now the house creaked with the kind of quiet only found in places that have outlived their purpose, and yet refused to go. Jackson sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on. His body ached, not just from the road, but from the long-term tension of survival. He rubbed his palms together, calluses catching like gravel. Bruno stirred beside him, ears flicking. "You trust her?" Jackson whispered. Bruno gave a soft whine, barely audible, and rested his chin on his front paws. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Outside, the wind picked up. The old tower behind the shop let out a hollow groan, like a ship straining at anchor. Rain tapped gently at the window, steady and patient. Jackson lay back, still dressed, still half alert. Sleep didn't come easy. Not anymore. Not after the desert. Not after what happened in Mosul. Bruno remained still by the heater until, just past 1 a.m., his body stiffened. A low growl rose from his throat, the kind that didn't wake the world but said something wasn't right. Jackson sat up, heart already thudding. "What is it?" Bruno didn't move toward the door. He stayed crouched near the floorboards, nose pressed to a gap in the wood just beneath the window. He let out one sharp exhale through his nose and looked at Jackson. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. Jackson knelt beside him, palms to the wood. The floor was old, warped in places, but one board felt different, raised slightly at the edge. He pried gently with his fingertips, and it lifted, without much effort. Dust curled upward, carrying the scent of cedar and paper. Beneath the board was a small envelope, yellowed with age and wrapped in a delicate, fraying ribbon. No dust on the paper. Someone had placed it recently. Or intentionally. Jackson hesitated, then opened it. Inside, a single slip of stationery. Handwritten. Steady, cursive script. When the wind changes, stay. He stared at the words for a long time. Not because they were mysterious, but because they weren't. They felt direct, personal, like a whisper meant only for him. He looked over at Bruno. "You think she put this here for us?" Bruno didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Jackson folded the note carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he lowered the board back into place and lay down again, eyes open in the dark. Sleep came like it always did, uneven, interrupted, more like falling through memory than resting. He dreamed of the tower in Iraq, the night the signal died. He was 27 when the ambush happened. A maintenance run, supposed to be routine. Jackson and 2 others had been tasked with fixing a broken relay mast outside the green zone. Halfway through, the gunfire came from the hills. He could still hear it, could still hear Maya screaming from behind the console, blood soaking the sand like oil. Could still hear himself yelling coordinates over the transmitter that never fired back. The comms went dark in the final 3 minutes. By the time backup arrived, Maya was gone. The signal tower had been shot through. The only thing left standing was Jackson. He jolted awake just before dawn. Cold sweat, jaw clenched. Bruno hadn't moved, but his eyes were open, glowing amber in the dim light. They met Jackson's, calm but watchful. "You were there too," Jackson said softly. "You remember." Bruno blinked once, then looked toward the window, where the first hint of grey was creeping in beneath the storm. Downstairs, he found Ruth already awake, standing by the stove in a robe and slippers that had seen better years. She held a mug of tea, steam curling into her silver hair. "You look like someone who just remembered a thing he's been trying to forget," she said without turning. Jackson didn't speak. She poured a second mug and slid it across the counter toward him. "I used to leave notes up there," she said. "Arthur liked hiding things in that floor, said secrets were safer if they stayed quiet long enough." Jackson took a sip, the warmth chasing something cold in his chest. He pulled the note from his jacket and set it on the counter. "You expected me to find this." "No," Ruth said, "but I hoped the kind of person who did would know what it meant." He leaned on the counter, staring at the slip of paper. "I don't stay," he said. "Not in towns, not in homes. I don't even unpack the truck." "But you carry tools," she replied, nodding to his bag. "And you fixed the radio signal last night." Jackson looked up, surprised. "How did you—" "Because when I turned on the dial at 3 a.m., it hummed. First time in 2 years. He didn't have an answer to that. She stepped closer and looked him straight in the eye. "People like you. The world told you to leave things behind. But some of those things are still waiting to be repaired." He exhaled. "I don't fix people." "No," she said. "But you fixed signals. That's a start." Bruno appeared in the doorway then, tail wagging low, like he'd decided the storm was over, at least for now. And Jackson, for the first time in months, didn't feel like running. The sky broke open in a sharp, clean blue the next morning, as if Hollow Creek had been holding its breath for too long and finally exhaled. Rain had passed, leaving behind a landscape washed and quiet. The kind of morning that felt temporary, too still to trust. Jackson stood behind the radio shop, staring up at the rusted antenna that leaned like a tired old soldier. The tower swayed slightly in the breeze, its bolts groaning in protest. Cables trailed down the siding, most of them frayed or snapped, and the junction box at the base looked like it hadn't been touched since Reagan. Bruno sniffed at the weeds growing through the gravel, tail slow but alert. He paused at the corner of the fence, gave one low huff, and started pawing at the dirt. "What is it, partner?" Jackson crouched beside him. Bruno barked once, not a warning, but a notification. Something was buried. Jackson dug with his hands. About 6 inches down, they found a split length of copper wire, severed at both ends. A clean break. No corrosion. Bruno sniffed again and sat back like he'd just uncovered a clue in a mystery only he understood. Jackson held the wire up, turning it in the morning light. "Looks like you found the pulse, old boy." He spent the next hour tracing the wire's path along the back of the shop. Most of the cable had sunk beneath old roots and collapsed earth, but enough remained to give him a layout. He fetched Ruth's toolbox from the attic and started stripping and splicing. By noon, his hands were streaked with grease and blood from an accidental nick, but the antenna was standing a little straighter. The cable was reconnected. The junction box hummed when he twisted the new line into place. Inside, he stared at the old radio console. Dials crusted with dust, switches stiff. He brushed everything down with a dry cloth, then cracked the lid open and checked the inner circuitry. Remarkably intact. Maybe Ruth had cleaned it more often than she let on. Or maybe, like her, it had simply refused to die. He flipped the main switch. A low hiss of static filled the room. Bruno raised his head from the floor, ears perked. Jackson leaned in, adjusting the frequency, turning the knob slowly through empty airwaves. Nothing but white noise, then a voice. Thin, crackling, but unmistakably hers. "If you can hear this, the beacon still stands." He froze. Bruno stood up, tail stiff. The voice repeated, softer this time, as if traveling a long way to reach them. "If you can hear this, the beacon still stands. Hollow Creek Radio, 91.3 FM. Keep the frequency kind." Jackson didn't move. He let the words hang in the room like smoke. It was Ruth's voice, not the one she used now, sharper, more weathered, but younger, clearer, recorded decades ago. He checked the reel-to-reel player beside the console. One of the old tapes had rewound itself and started playing as the system powered up. A tape labeled in black ink. Storm broadcast, 1987. The timing, the message. The way Bruno had sniffed out the wire like he was being pulled by instinct. Jackson sat back in the old leather chair and exhaled. "She left it for someone," he said aloud. "Not for no one." Bruno padded forward and rested his head on Jackson's knee. The doorbell chimed downstairs. He stood, still dizzy from the voice, and walked to the front. A woman stood outside the shop, wind-blown and holding a leather satchel across her chest. She was young, late 20s maybe. Tall, sharp-featured, with hazel eyes that darted quickly like she was always scanning for details. Her jeans were muddy at the hem, boots scuffed, hair in a low braid. "You Jackson Cole?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I'm with the County Historical Archives," she said, pulling out an ID badge. "Maya Reyes. Ruth used to send me handwritten logs for the station. We were digitizing her broadcasts before the grant money dried up." Jackson nodded once. "I heard the signal. This morning. You rebooted 91.3. That's the tower, he said. Not me. Maya stepped inside without waiting. She walked straight to the console, her fingers grazing the dials, like she already knew them. She recorded messages for every flood, every winter blackout, every fire, but she always ended the same way. Jackson raised an eyebrow. With that phrase, Maya said softly, "The beacon still stands." Bruno sniffed her once, then lay back down. Maya glanced down. "That your dog?" "Name's Bruno. He the one who sniffed out the old cable?" Jackson smirked. "Yeah, he's smarter than me most days." Maya opened her satchel and spread out several documents on the counter. Handwritten letters, maps, land surveys, each signed by Ruth Everwood. She tried to protect this land. Maya said, "Filed historical registry paperwork, drafted community trust deeds. Most of it was denied or delayed, but some of it." She pulled out one paper in particular, a notarized claim dated 20 years prior, tying the radio tower to the original town charter. She believed this station wasn't just history. Maya said, "She believed it was leverage." Jackson leaned over the document. "You mean legal protection?" "I mean if someone wanted to turn Hollow Creek into a lakeside resort." Maya said, eyes narrowing. "This station would be a big, inconvenient piece of evidence." Jackson rubbed his face. His hand smelled like copper and rust. "I thought I was just fixing an old signal," he said. Maya met his eyes. "You might have just lit a fuse." Behind them, the console clicked softly as the tape reached its end. Bruno lifted his head and stared at the window. A breeze caught the edge of the curtain, revealing a silver SUV idling across the street. A man in a charcoal coat stood by the driver's side door, staring up at the tower. Jackson followed his gaze. "Who the hell is that?" Maya didn't answer, but Bruno growled low, deep and certain. Not a warning, a promise. The silver SUV came back 2 days later. This time, it didn't idle across the street. It rolled into the gravel lot behind Hollow Creek Radio and parked like it belonged there. Jackson was on the roof, tightening bolts along the new antenna line, when Bruno gave a single sharp bark from below. Jackson peered over the edge and saw the man step out. Tall, maybe mid-50s, trim suit under an open overcoat. Salt and pepper hair slicked back like he meant for it to hold all day. Sunglasses, though there was barely any sun. He paused, took a long look at the tower, then at the old radio sign over the front door, and finally at Bruno, who was planted squarely in the center of the walkway, tail low, body tense. The man hesitated, then smiled like a man used to disarming people. "Nice dog," he called up. Jackson climbed down slowly, the wrench still in his hand. Bruno didn't move an inch. "Can I help you?" Jackson asked flatly. "Name's Graham Deek," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm with Deek Development Group. We're working on a lakeside revitalization project. Hollow Creek's on the short list." Jackson didn't shake his hand. "You the guy sniffing around Ruth Everwood's land?" Deek laughed, easy. "I prefer interested investor. I met Ruth years ago, tried to buy this property once. She declined." "She still declines," Jackson said. Deek's smile faded just a fraction. "I heard someone restarted the old beacon. That's ambitious." "It's just a radio," Jackson said. Deek looked at the tower again. "In a town like this, even a whisper can sound like a rebellion." Bruno stepped forward, just enough to make his presence clear. Deek took the hint. "Well," he said, stepping back toward the SUV. "If Ruth wants to talk again, here's my card." He slid it into the fence post slat. Jackson waited until the car was gone, then picked up the card and folded it in half without looking. That night, Ruth didn't mention the visit, but her hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, and Jackson noticed she'd double-locked the door before bed. The next morning, she was gone. Jackson found her in the rocker by the attic window, wrapped in her shawl, eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips like she'd fallen asleep mid-sentence. Bruno sat at her feet, unmoving, watching, guarding. She hadn't made a sound. The doctor from town came quietly. So did the pastor and a post office clerk who cried harder than anyone expected. They buried Ruth on the hill above the tower, near the birch tree she used to call her compass. Bruno didn't bark the whole day. After the funeral, Jackson walked through the empty house. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were grieving. He moved through each room, checking the windows, the locks. It wasn't just habit. Something didn't feel right. Bruno kept circling the back hallway near the pantry, nose low, tail stiff. "What is it?" Jackson asked. Bruno stopped in front of an old shelf and sat. Jackson ran his hand along the wall behind it. One panel sounded hollow. He pried it loose with a screwdriver and found a staircase, narrow, stone-lined, leading downward into dark. Bruno didn't hesitate. He descended first, paws echoing on the cold steps. The air below was cool and still, laced with the scent of cedar and something older. The walls were stone, the floor packed dirt. A workbench lined one wall, covered in rusted tools and cracked mason jars. At the far end of the cellar, an iron locker sat wedged under a shelf. Inside, Jackson found jars labeled in Ruth's handwriting: victory seeds, aurora beans, frostbite barley, crops from another era, carefully preserved. Nearby, a box of yellowing papers, old land surveys, notarized claims, a leather-bound ledger with a faded title etched into the cover, Hollow Creek Community Trust. He opened it and ran a finger down the first page. Names, dates, donations. Ruth's handwriting traced decades of quiet resistance. "This isn't just a cellar," he murmured. "It's a vault." Bruno let out a sharp breath. Jackson turned and saw it, a faint, fresh line across the threshold, charred black. He knelt and touched the brick. It smelled faintly of gasoline. Someone had been down there, recently, and they hadn't come for the seeds. He swept the area. The back window was cracked, its latch bent. A trail of disturbed dust marked the floor near the far wall. He grabbed his phone, took photos of everything: the scorched line, the seed jars, the legal files. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet without Ruth's footsteps. He kept the lights off and watched from the kitchen window, Bruno at his side. Just past 2 a.m., Bruno growled low, body pressed to the floor. Jackson smelled it next. Gasoline. He was out the door in seconds, flashlight in hand. The porch reeked of fuel. A soaked rag lay coiled beneath the railing. He stomped it out, heart pounding, and scanned the trees. In the distance, a motor flared to life. A small boat, maybe, cutting across the lake. He stood on the porch until the wind shifted and the smell faded. Bruno sat beside him, unmoving. Jackson knelt, rested a hand on the dog's broad shoulders. "They tried to burn her legacy," he said quietly. Bruno pressed his head into Jackson's palm, eyes locked on the lake. Jackson rose slowly. "Well," he said, "then we don't just guard it, we fight for it." Inside, the radio's dial glowed faintly, and somewhere in the dark, Ruth's voice echoed from the last recorded reel. "If you can hear this, the beacon still stands." The storm rolled in fast, the way northern storms do, without warning, without mercy. By dusk, the wind was howling like it had a score to settle. Snow hammered against the windows of the old radio station, whiting out the lake, the roads, the trees. Inside, Jackson sat hunched over the radio console, twisting the frequency dial with a steady hand. Bruno lay by the door, body alert, ears twitching at every gust of wind that found its way through the attic rafters. Static crackled through the speakers. Then, Between two sharp bursts of white noise, a voice. Thin, high-pitched, frayed at the edges. "Can anyone hear me?" Jackson froze. He turned the gain up and leaned in. "Cold. Can't see the road." A child's voice. He keyed the mic. "This is Hollow Creek Beacon. Say again. Identify your location." Nothing but static. Then faint and trembling. "I don't know where I am. There's snow everywhere. Grandpa said the tower watches the stars." Jackson stood so fast the chair fell backward. Bruno was already up, pacing tight circles by the door. "Bruno, we've got a kid out there." He grabbed his coat, flashlight, emergency pack, and Ruth's old wind map from the wall. The boy had said something about the tower. Jackson scanned the chart. There was one fire lookout tower still standing along the northern ridge, marked in Ruth's handwriting with a single word. Stillness. The wind whipped harder as he opened the front door. Snow came in sideways. Bruno bounded ahead, tail stiff, head low to the ground. His body moved with the precision of a trained tracker. Jackson followed, boots sinking into the drifts, breath fogging in thick bursts. The forest swallowed them whole within minutes. Each step forward felt like wading into another world. Trees blurred by snow. No sounds except wind and breath. But Bruno kept moving, pausing only to sniff the air or change direction. He wasn't guessing. He was following something Jackson couldn't see. After nearly 40 minutes, Bruno barked once, sharp and certain. Jackson pushed through a curtain of snow and saw it. The base of the old wooden tower, half buried in white. A shadow slumped near the stairs, small, curled. He ran. "Hey, kid!" No answer. He dropped to his knees. The boy's face was pale, lips cracked from cold, lashes crusted with ice. But he was breathing. Shallow, uneven, but breathing. Bruno stood close, guarding. Jackson wrapped the boy in his jacket, lifted him gently, and spoke low into his ear. "You're okay. We've got you. You're not alone." As they made their way back, the boy stirred, mumbled something. "What's that?" Jackson asked. The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "Grandpa said they used to watch the stars from the radio tower." Jackson felt his stomach drop. "Your grandpa's name?" he asked. The boy shivered once. Graham Deek." Back at the station, Jackson lit the stove, melted snow for water, and wrapped the boy in blankets. Bruno lay nearby, eyes tracking every movement, tail still. The storm raged outside, but inside the walls there was warmth. Barely, but enough. Jackson checked the boy's fingers for frostbite, rubbed his hands to bring the color back. The boy winced, then looked up with wide, glassy eyes. "You found me," he said. Jackson nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Yeah, kid, we did. What's your name?" "Jackson. And this guy here's Bruno." Bruno wagged his tail once, solemnly. The boy gave the faintest smile. "My name's Eli." Jackson blinked. That name. He'd heard it before, in passing, from Maya, from Earl down at the hardware store. Graham Deek's grandson, the heir to the man trying to bulldoze Hollow Creek into another resort town. Eli Deek, curled up now on Ruth Everwood's couch, shivering, vulnerable, still not old enough to understand what legacy meant. Jackson leaned back in the old wooden chair, staring at the fire. Bruno sat beside him, watching both of them. He could have left the kid out there, could have walked away, pretended he hadn't heard the signal. But something deeper than principle had stopped him. Something old. Something Ruth had planted in him the day she said, "Every story needs a caretaker." Bruno let out a low sigh and rested his head on Jackson's boot. "You always know, don't you?" Jackson whispered. Bruno didn't move, but Jackson could feel it. The same steadiness that had kept him alive across deserts and years and disappointments. This dog didn't follow orders. He followed truth. Jackson looked at the sleeping boy, then toward the window, where the storm had started to ease. "Guess we're not done," he said. Bruno thumped his tail once, as if agreeing. In the stillness that followed, Jackson rose, crossed to the radio, and keyed the mic. "This is Hollow Creek Beacon. We have a child safe and warm. If you're listening, the beacon still stands." The snow had barely melted when Bruno started pacing near the cellar door again. Jackson noticed it the second time it happened. Same low growl in his throat. Same deliberate movement. Not anxious, not alert, intentional. Like a man retracing steps he knew he missed. "You found something else," Jackson muttered. Bruno didn't look back. He walked straight down the stairs, paw pads whispering against the cold stone, and stopped at the far wall, just beside the old shelf where they'd found the Victory Seeds and Community Trust ledger days before. Jackson followed, flashlight in hand. Bruno pawed at the baseboard once, then sat. Jackson knelt, his fingers pressed along the bottom edge of the wooden wall. There, a faint seam. Not stone, not original. He pried gently with a chisel, the old wood cracking with a reluctant sigh. Behind the panel, tucked deep in a recess in the stone, sat a narrow iron box, dull, heavy, sealed with a brass clasp. Jackson stared at it. Dust floated in the air like ash. He set the box on the workbench and flipped open the lid. Inside, layers of paper wrapped in oilskin. Everything preserved. The first item, a stack of unredeemed World War II war bonds, issued under Ruth Everwood's name and Arthur's before her. Some dated back to 1942, beneath them maps, hand-drawn, annotated in Ruth's fine script. Property lines, wetlands, conservation zones, sections of Hollow Creek marked with notes like protected marsh and seed heritage land. Then folded with careful precision, a legal petition. Signed, dated, never mailed. Petition for the establishment of the Hollow Creek Community Conservation Sanctuary. Filed by Ruth Everwood. Purpose: to protect designated land and structures from commercial development, ensuring public access and heritage preservation in perpetuity. Jackson stared at the document. This was it. If filed properly, it didn't just challenge Graham Deake's claim to develop the lakeside. It shattered it. Bruno let out a low breath, like the weight of the moment had settled on him, too. Jackson looked down at the dog. "You really don't miss much, do you?" Bruno tilted his head. An answer or a challenge. Maybe both. Later that afternoon, Maya arrived in her jeep, covered in road dust and nerves. Jackson laid out the documents on the kitchen table, like evidence in a courtroom. She studied each sheet with the care of someone who'd been waiting her whole life to prove something right. "These are real," she whispered. "The war bonds show federal investment. The maps outline protected land. And this," she tapped the petition, "this is legal fire. Can we use it? If we bring this to the town council during the public hearing and file it with the registry before then, yeah, we can stop him." Jackson nodded. Then he looked toward the window, toward the tower. "That's not enough." Maya blinked. "What do you mean?" "We can't just show them the paper. We have to remind them who she was, why she did this. Some of them have forgotten." "You want to use the radio?" Jackson was already moving. She left a voice. "We're gonna let it speak." That night, the radio tower hummed again. Jackson and Maya worked side by side, threading wires, reseating the old reels, cleaning contacts until their hands were black with dust and copper. Bruno kept watch by the doorway, ears pricked, eyes tracking the horizon. At 6:43 p.m., Jackson flipped the master switch. Static. Then the reel spun. Ruth's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, the beacon still stands." Maya closed her eyes. For a moment, Jackson swore he saw the ghost of a smile on her face. Then the signal went live. Jackson keyed the mic. "This is Hollow Creek Beacon, transmitting live across the bay. Tonight, we're airing a message from someone who never stopped believing this town was worth remembering." He stepped back and let the tape roll. Ruth's voice came through again, stronger now. "In times of silence, you send a signal. Even if no one answers, you send it. Because someone out there might be listening, and if they are, they'll know they're not alone." Across town, the lights in windows dimmed as people turned their radios up. Old men in fishing coats, widows in kitchen aprons, teenagers who had never heard the signal before. They all stopped, listened. Ruth continued. "This land remembers, the seeds remember, and when the wind changes, it brings the past with it." Jackson watched the board. Every light on the panel lit up. Signal strength, tower load, amplification. Everything was holding. Then came the final line. "If you can hear this, it means you're part of something that still matters." He leaned forward. "And if you believe it too," he said, voice low but clear, "join us at the town hall, Friday night." Silence. Then Bruno barked, once loud and sharp. A beat later, the first phone line rang. Then another. Then another. Maya laughed. Jackson just leaned back in the chair, a grin creeping across his face. Outside, the wind picked up, and Hollow Creek, forgotten and fading, held its breath, because the old voice was back, and it had something left to say. The chairs were already half full when Jackson walked into the Hollow Creek Town Hall with Maya by his side and Bruno at his heel. The room smelled like wood polish and old coffee. Generations of arguments had taken place here, generations of forgetting, too. But tonight something different hung in the air, anticipation, maybe, or the weight of a town holding its breath. Bruno padded silently, settling beside Jackson's chair near the front. His ears twitched at the rising voices, but his body stayed still, calm, ready. Graham Deek arrived last. He wore the same charcoal coat, but tonight there was no overcoat polish to his presence. His jaw was tighter, eyes darker. And beside him, holding a manila folder with both hands, stood Eli. The boy looked small under the fluorescent lights, but he held himself with surprising steadiness. Mayor Evelyn Hart banged the gavel twice. She was in her 70s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with the voice of someone who'd raised both sons and hell. "This hearing is now in session," she said. "Tonight we're reviewing the proposal from Deek Development regarding lakeside revitalization." Graham stepped forward. His voice was smooth, practiced. "We envision Hollow Creek as a modern retreat, a marina, boutique cabins, spa facilities, environmental tourism. This project brings jobs, revenue, and renewal." A few polite nods. Jackson stood, uninvited. "May I speak?" The mayor nodded. He walked to the center, carrying Ruth's leather ledger in one hand and a folded petition in the other. Bruno followed, silent and imposing. "I'm Jackson Cole," he began. "I live in the old radio station. Ruth Everwood gave me shelter when no one else would. She gave me purpose." He turned toward the crowd. "This town has roots, deep ones, and Ruth tried to protect them." He unfolded the petition, held it up. "This document, found in her cellar, outlines the creation of the Hollow Creek Community Conservation Sanctuary. Signed, dated, ready to file." He dropped it on the table. "This, along with these maps, bonds, and property filings, legally protects her land from commercial development. But more than that, it honors the spirit of what she built." Then he lifted the microphone from the council table and flipped the switch. Ruth's voice filled the room, crackling through the old speaker. "If you're hearing this, the beacon still stands." The silence that followed was complete. Even Graham looked away for a moment. Jackson looked down at Bruno, then back to the crowd. I could have let this stay buried, but someone taught me the value of listening. Then, unexpectedly, Eli stepped forward. He walked to the microphone slowly, gripping the folder like a shield. His voice was soft but clear. "This man found me in the snow," Eli said. "I was lost, cold. He heard me on the radio. He came anyway." He turned to face the council. "He didn't ask who my grandfather was. He just listened. That saved my life." Graham inhaled slowly. His jaw worked like he was biting back old pride. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood and walked to the front. "I came here to build," he said, voice lower now, "to turn this place into something profitable. But standing here—" He looked at Eli, then at Jackson, then at the crowd. "I see something else." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I propose a revision. We retain limited lakeside development, docks, trails, environmental exhibits, but the radio station, Ruth's home, and the surrounding acres stay untouched." He paused. "They become the Ruth Everwood Community Center, run by locals, protected by law." The room was still. Then the mayor leaned forward. "You're willing to walk away from your full proposal?" Graham looked at Eli. His voice was softer now. "Sometimes you lose money to win something greater." Someone in the back clapped once, then another, and then the room erupted. Not loud, not rowdy, just real. Bruno barked once, short, sharp, like punctuation. The mayor nodded. "Motion noted. Council will vote." But everyone knew the decision had already been made. As people filed out, Maya turned to Jackson. "You realize what just happened?" Jackson looked at her. "We didn't just save a building," he said. "We saved a voice." Bruno trotted ahead through the crowd, tail high. A child reached down to pat his back. And Bruno let them. Spring came early to Hollow Creek the following year. The snow melted off the hills like someone had exhaled, and the lake lost its ice overnight. One morning, the sky turned the color of worn denim, and the wind carried the scent of lilac before the flowers had even bloomed. The old Everwood house still stood at the edge of town, but its name had changed. Carved into a fresh pine board above the porch were the words, "Everwood Seed and Story House Inside." The front room no longer smelled of mildew and silence. Sunlight poured through wide windows onto rows of old oak tables lined with mason jars. Each jar held seeds, neatly labeled in black ink, some from Ruth's cellar, others donated by local families after the town hall vote. There were rows of aurora beans, firefly tomatoes, frost hardy lettuce, and barley from Earl Benning's grandfather's farm. Every label had two names, the plant and the family that saved it. In the corner where Ruth's rocker used to sit, a circle of kids now gathered twice a week. They listened to Maya read from the old Hollow Creek journals, sometimes Ruth's own diary entries. She had a soft voice, slow and warm, the kind that held a room even when the wind was high outside. Jackson sat nearby, a quiet observer, often fixing something in the background. A lamp, a hinge, a shelf someone had leaned on too hard. But his eyes always stayed on the kids. Bruno lay beside the front door like a statue, but his ears moved constantly. When a child entered, he'd lift his head, sniff the air, and wag his tail in slow, thoughtful sweeps. Someone had made a tag for his collar. Chief of Safety. He wore it like a medal. Outside, wind chimes made from old radio coils and kitchen spoons swayed under the porch eaves. Their tones were uneven, imperfect, but they sang just the same. Jackson had installed them with Maya's help, using bits from the attic, and Ruth's old drawer of junk too stubborn to die. On most days, the radio in the back room played quietly. It was Ruth's beacon, now restored and modernized. Jackson broadcasted from it each morning at 8 a.m. Weather, planting tips, community notices, and sometimes a story from Ruth's archive. He kept her voice alive, not out of sentimentality, but because it still had something to teach. "Good morning, Hollow Creek," he'd say. "The lake's breathing easy today. Ground still damp, but warm enough for onions. If you're heading to the western trails, watch out for downed branches near the ridge. And if you're planting anything stubborn, talk to it. It helps." Once a month, Maya hosted seed swaps on the porch. People came from nearby towns, bringing stories in envelopes, jars of forgotten corn, squash seeds wrapped in wax, paper, marigolds from a grandmother's funeral. They didn't just trade seeds. They traded memory. Eli came often, sometimes with Graham, who kept to the back of the room, silent, eyes softening when Ruth's voice played. Sometimes Eli came alone, riding his bike with a satchel full of old photographs to add to the growing postcard wall. Each photo had a note: "My mum's wedding here," or "Dad built this dock in '79. The wall stretched across an entire hallway now. Jackson had started calling it the memory spine. One afternoon, Maya found a dusty cassette player buried in a box of donations. When she popped the first tape in, Ruth's laughter spilled out. Unexpected, wild, unapologetic. Jackson paused mid-repair and closed his eyes. "You still in here?" he whispered. That evening, after the visitors left, he sat on the porch with Bruno at his feet. Maya brought out coffee in 2 mismatched mugs and leaned against the railing beside him. "You think she'd like it?" she asked. Jackson took a long breath. "She'd hate the font on the sign," he said. "But the rest?" He looked around, the blooming lilacs, the flickering porch light, the faint crackle of radio static behind the windows. "She'd say we did it right." Bruno thumped his tail. Maya smiled and sipped her coffee. Down by the lake, the windmill spun slowly, catching the last of the golden light. In the distance, someone rang the old cowbell that now marked the beginning of story hour. Children's voices answered. And the town of Hollow Creek, once nearly forgotten, settled into a new rhythm, one built from soil, sound waves, and stories too stubborn to fade. The airwaves of Hollow Creek began to change. Once used only for weather updates and Ruth's archived voice, the restored frequency now had a new life, a new rhythm. Every Sunday evening, the beacon played something different, something the whole town now waited for. Voices of Hollow Creek. Maya sat behind the microphone, her voice calm and steady, the kind that wrapped around listeners like an old blanket. Each week, she invited someone new from the town to sit across from her in the converted backroom studio. No script, just memory. It started with Earl Benning, who told a story about the barley his grandfather grew during the Dust Bowl. Then came Ellie Price, who spoke about losing her brother in Korea, and how they used to listen to Ruth's broadcasts together on a wooden Philco radio. Teenagers told tales of first kisses behind the seed house. An old fisherman recounted a storm in '82 that nearly took his boat, and how he swore the beacon's hum guided him home. The radio became something more than a transmitter. It became a confessional, a keeper of things once too quiet to speak aloud. Each story ended the same way. The guest would strike the little brass chime beside the mic, a soft, bright note, and say the final line. And the beacon still stands. Maya called it a ritual. Jackson called it a promise. Out back, Bruno listened from the porch. He no longer bounded through snow or trotted ahead on the trail, but he remained steady. His muzzle had grayed, and one hip moved slower than the other, but his ears still twitched at the sound of Maya's voice through the open window. He knew the rhythm. When the music faded and the stories began, he lay still, eyes half closed, listening. Sometimes children would pass and stop to pat his head. They called him Old Chief. He never moved much anymore, but if a kid lingered too long or stepped past the gate, his eyes would open. amber and watchful, and the message was clear. This place is protected. Inside, Jackson had carved a small wooden plaque and nailed it beside the porch swing. Bruno radio dog, war dog, town dog, still listening. One afternoon, Maya walked into the seed library with a large manila envelope. Jackson looked up from the counter where he was restringing a broken wind chime. "I filed it," she said, holding out the letter. "The Whitlow Scholarship." He blinked. "Already?" She nodded. "Ruth's war bonds. We used them to create a fund. It'll go to students interested in community radio, seed preservation, local storytelling, anything that keeps this place alive." Jackson took the letter, eyes scanning the seal, the signature. "First award goes out this fall," she added. "I already have a couple of essays." "Let me guess," he said. "They want to be the next Ruth." She laughed. "No, they want to be the next them. That's the point." He folded the letter, tucked it under the old radio reel. Out front, a group of high schoolers stood at the seed tables. One pointed at a label, "Victory Beans, donated by the Mahoney family, 1945. Another traced the cursive handwriting across a jar of zinnia seeds. "People are listening," Maya said softly. "More than that," Jackson replied. "They're repeating." That night, as the sun dipped behind the lake and the sky turned soft orange, Maya prepared the weekly segment. Her voice filtered through the town again, warm and low. "Tonight on Voices of Hollow Creek, we remember the ones who planted before us, and the ones who will harvest after." She played a recording of Ruth's earliest known broadcast, grainy but fierce. "In the stillest places, stories grow best, because silence gives them room to root." Out on the porch, Bruno lifted his head. The bell on his collar jingled once, faint but clear. And Jackson, standing under the eaves with his hand on the doorframe, whispered, "Still guarding, huh, boy?" Bruno didn't answer. He didn't need to. The town already knew. The morning broke gentle over Hollow Creek. No sirens, no headlines, just sunlight through birch leaves and the low hum of a radio warming up in the back room of the Everwood Seed and Story House. The porch creaked as Jackson stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee, one in each hand. Bruno lay by the railing, older now, his breathing slow and steady, his fur thick with silver around the muzzle. The brass tag on his collar still read Chief of Safety. And somehow, even without moving much anymore, he still made everyone feel safer. The bell above the door jingled. A voice called out, "Mr. Cole?" Jackson turned to see Eli walking across the garden path, a little taller now, hair a touch longer, his step more certain. Behind him trailed a line of children, 7 or 8 of them, carrying notebooks and backpacks, eyes wide with curiosity. Eli raised a hand in greeting. "Field trip," he said. "Social studies and living history." Jackson chuckled. Dangerous combination. One of the kids, a girl with bright red glasses, stepped forward and pointed toward Bruno. "Is that the dog from the rescue story?" Jackson crouched beside Bruno, set down a coffee mug, and ran his fingers gently over the old shepherd's back. "He didn't just survive the storm," Jackson said. "He helped someone find their way out of it." Bruno's ears flicked once, just enough. The girl smiled. "Can I pet him?" "He might let you," Jackson said, "but you gotta earn it." She knelt carefully, hand out, patient. Bruno sniffed once, then nudged her palm. She beamed like she'd just touched magic. Inside, the radio crackled to life, as it always did at the top of the hour. Maya's voice, steady and warm. "Tonight we honor a dog who didn't bark for food, but barked for a town that almost forgot how to listen." The children gathered by the seed shelves, asking about the jars, the handwriting, the names on each tag. One boy pointed to a photo of Ruth above the fireplace. "Who's that?" Eli answered without hesitation. "She's the reason we still have this place." Another child looked at the microphone in the broadcast booth. "Does it still work?" Jackson stepped behind the console, flipped a familiar switch, and held up a finger. "It still works," he said. "But the question is, what do you want to say?" They stared back, unsure. He smiled. "Take your time. Stories last longer when you tell them right." Later, as the sun slanted through the windows and the kids filed out with Eli, Jackson remained on the porch. Bruno rested his head on the threshold, eyes half closed. The wind picked up softly, making the wind chimes sing in scattered notes. Jackson looked out over the bay, where the water caught the light just right, like glass remembering how to be river. Behind him, the old transmitter blinked, and Ruth's voice returned for one last loop. "If you can hear this, then the story's still yours to carry." Jackson leaned down, whispered into Bruno's ear. "Still guarding, huh, boy?" The dog didn't move, but his tail tapped once against the floor. A small, quiet yes. If you've ever had a dog who waited for you at the door, who knew when something was wrong, before you said a word, then you already understand this story. Bruno didn't bark for food. He barked for what mattered, for a voice, a home, a second chance. What's your story with a loyal pet? Drop it in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel, German Shepherd Stories, and help us share more tales that honor these silent heroes. Because sometimes the bravest ones don't wear capes. They wear fur, wait at the door, and never stop guarding.